Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Vassals of Kingsgrave. And today we are finishing up our conversation on Jack the Ripper. So I am No True Lady, also known as Julia in real life, and we have got Bina 007 and FT Ward with us today. But we're going to wrap up with talking about the main suspects of the killings and then the pop culture impact of the Jack the Ripper case. The investigation of Jack the Ripper, there was a big investigation at the time, and there were a number of suspects that were pointed out by the investigators. And I guess we can just go through one by one and all sort of give our opinions. The first one was a man named Montagu John Druitt. He was named in this McNaughton memorandum written for the Home Secretary in the 1890s. And correct me if I'm wrong, Bina, but the Home Secretary is kind of the equivalent of the Secretary of State?
Yes, so he is the government minister, the cabinet minister, in fact, who's in charge with everything to do with justice and policing in England. So back in the days of empire, we had the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary. And so he would be formally in charge of the police, formally in charge of the judiciary as well as any home terrorism, and therefore spying in the home nation, which in those days was basically Irish terrorism.
Yeah.
So it would be almost like... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, that's actually a big part of one of the investigators in the Ripper case was a former investigator into Irish terrorism at the time, and we were discussing last time how he wasn't really qualified to be doing this type of investigation, but he was just given the job as sort of I guess sort of a cronyism thing a little bit.
Well, I think the problem is that the concept of policing was relatively new at this time, maybe 40 years old in England, and essentially, insofar as it existed at all, it was at a senior level about anti-terrorism. So you probably couldn't become head of the Metropolitan Police without that kind of background, and like you say, completely no experience for any kind of domestic sort of crime, let alone a serial killer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, today we would be like, why is that person in charge of the investigation? But back then, it was pretty much all they had.
So I had a few questions for Bina. I don't know if you covered it, but it sounds like the Home Secretary would be something like our American Homeland Security, and he might be something like kind of like the Director of Homeland Security or almost the Attorney General of the country.
Because we would have had a separate Solicitor General and a separate Chief Justice, and we would have had a separate person not called Homeland Security who was... So this is the person to whom all those branches report. So the Home Secretary in England is a very senior cabinet position. The only person more important is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so the Finance Minister. So, it's a portfolio of responsibilities.
Yeah, the Attorney General is not really an attorney per se. He's in charge of all the federal law enforcement, I guess.
Yeah, same here.
Okay, and then if you could talk about like the city police versus the metropolitan police, and would they also be directly responsible to the Home Secretary, or is that not the case?
Of the Metropolitan Police are ultimately a branch of the London government, which is ultimately a branch of Parliament, right? So everything reports to Parliament and therefore the Home Secretary. And the same is also true of the City Police. It's just that the City Police would also have had a dashed line to the Lord Mayor of London, but effectively it's still the Home Secretary.
Okay, so that's the guy who Montagu John Druitt was mentioned to in a memo in the 1890s. So there's some stuff here written about him in the show notes that that indicates he was very establishment. Bina, can you just explain what Wykehamist, Oxon? Well, he went to Oxford, Oxonian, and then MCC. What are all those things?
Well, a Wykehamist is someone who went to a very elite private school called Winchester, which was founded by William of Wykeham. Oxonian went to Oxford University, and then he obviously has graduated from university and become a barrister, so a very senior lawyer. And I put jokingly an MCC member, which means he's also part of an elite club, a cricket club, which I'm also a member of. But it was just shorthand, like a very sort of parochial British shorthand to say that this guy is about as establishment as you get in a period when the English elite establishment was probably as powerful in society as it's ever been. So if he were going to commit murders, then he would absolutely be sort of protected by society, I guess, if anyone even suspected such a thing. And I would draw the comparison with Kim Philby, who was, one of the famous Cambridge spies in the 1950s and came from a similar background, and he was kind of able to operate in plain sight because just no one could believe that someone like that would do such a thing. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very real thing in this case, isn't it? That the notion that an Englishman would not have committed these crimes, and there's a certain amount of racism inherent in that, but I think the people at the time just refused to believe that an Englishman would have been responsible.
Yeah, definitely. I think not just racism, but class prejudice as well, and therefore
and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, anti-Semitism. I mean, the whole kit and caboodle. And I think that something that's like moderately laudable about the police is that they did seem to be conscious of the potential for certainly anti-Semitism to get into kind of mob hands, and so try to dampen things down. I mean, I think partly it was the odds of the thing. So if the murders are committed in Whitechapel with a predominantly sort of immigrant Jewish population, then chances, it's higher chances that someone of that background is going to have done it. But I think the police were very conscious of not trying to let that get out of hand. But it's amazing how inbuilt it is in us. And even when I was reading this sort of case against Montagu John Druitt, I was like, I literally, the first thing that came in my mind is I wrote it in the show notes, and it's not ironic. I just literally couldn't believe it. Someone who was an MCC member could do such a thing, and that's appalling, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not accusing you of anything, but I think that's a very natural reaction, and certainly one that was prevalent at the time.
I was going to say that I similarly, reading about Druitt's background, I'm also like, no. But then I also think about, how there's a tendency even in American culture to protect or disbelieve it when people who are upper class commit crimes. And it's like, no, they wouldn't do that.
And how would you characterize Druitt's family? Would you say he's upper middle class? It's hard for me as an American to kind of work out what Oxford meant or what Wykehamist meant exactly.
Well, his background, Wykehamist, Oxonian, MCC member, up to that point, you could either be a sort of minor aristo or upper middle class. I think the fact that he becomes a working barrister means he's probably upper middle class. A man trained to rule, put it that way. At a time when we did rule.
He came from a family of prominent doctors and surgeons. His father, his uncle, I think a cousin, were all prominent, not just like country doctors. They were wrote textbooks and stuff.
Royal College of Medicine and Royal Society, absolutely. He was
being raised to have a proper career, to be a prolific member of society.
Absolutely, and not just a career, but to be prominent. And it didn't list the clubs he was a member of in the book, but I would bet he's a member of White's. I mean, I think this is a guy who would feel comfortable rubbing shoulders with royalty and aristocrats and government, senior government officials. Absolutely.
There is a party invitation that came to light, but he's on the guest list for a party with Prince Eddie in December of 1888. So he definitely was of a notable social standing.
Absolutely. And certainly it would not, I mean, if he just happened to be the right age, he could very well have gone to school with members of the royal family, and he was absolutely in the right place to do so.
Which all begs the question, how did he end up as a Ripper suspect?
Well,
right?
I believe the answer to that is that his family came into possession of certain information that led them to believe that he was a credible Ripper suspect. That would be my short answer.
But we don't know what those facts are, right? Or do we?
That's correct.
So
no.
McNaughton just says, certain facts pointing to the conclusion were not in possession of the police until some years after I became a detective officer. It's so ropey.
Correct.
It's so ropey.
That implies that the actual evidence was in possession of the police at some time, which I'm not even certain I believe. But it's clear that after I don't know if we want to just talk about his death and his life a little bit. But after his suicide, that his brother, who kind of took care of things after his death, went to, I guess we should say he was a barrister and a teacher and assistant master at a boarding school, from which he was fired for some quote-unquote serious trouble, sometimes late in November or early December of 1888. And then he committed suicide shortly after, I think generally considered December 1st, but I mean, there's no way to know for sure the actual date where he killed himself. But
yeah, because his body was found in the river, and all they could really tell was it had been in there for some time.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the kind of thing, even today, they'd be able to tell exactly how long he was dead, but certainly at the time. But he did have a return ticket, train ticket, dated December 1st. So it appears that it would have been the end of November or something. But his brother went to the school, went through his things, and at that time, I believe, came into some evidence. And again, it should be stated that there was kind of a hysteria at this time, and any kind of peculiar or strange behavior would have been viewed as suspicious. So we can't say for certain. And I guess I should also say that Druitt's family has a history of insanity and suicide in it as well.
But, I mean, if you're Druitt's family and you're Uber establishment in a period when the establishment closes ranks and protects itself, why on earth would you tell anybody? I mean, he's dead, the murderers are going to cease. Why would you feel the need to unburden yourself in such a way?
I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Crawford letter. I don't know if that's...
No.
But I don't know. Let me see if I can find a link to it. But the Crawford letter is a letter written by the Earl of Crawford, I believe, to Sir William Anderson. It's introducing a female family member of a Jack the Ripper suspect.
Oh, I do know the one you're talking about, that it was a sister or another female member had come to the police and said it was my relative. It was something to that effect?
I put it in the show notes or in the chat there, but it's a letter from again the Earl of Crawford, who again is
I've seen this
I guess as you can get, where it's a letter of introduction between a woman who has the family member who she believes is, quote, the author of the Whitechapel murders, and Sir William Anderson. It is undated, but it appears to be, my guess would have been December or November. I mean, or December probably, or November. Late. I mean, it seems like when the Ripper investigation is still current. And it's the letter of introduction. And there are connections between Druitt's sister and the Earl of Crawford. I think they had a similar, at least one close friend in common who was a famous librarian or bibliophile. But I think that's kind of lays out why the family wants to contact the police, just to kind of I don't want to say clear their names, but to remove themselves from guilt, but to let the police and the government know what happened.
Do you think we're as guilty as people who thought that, oh, well, very sort of posh people couldn't have committed these murders, that we place more weight on evidence when it's written by the Earl of Crawford wrote it? I mean, establishment members, so, evidently must have some veracity. I mean, it looks really authentic when you look at the copper plate writing, but has it been authenticated? Has anyone tried to establish the
I would just say that if I was making a modern forgery, I would have put a date on there. So I think the absence of certain details, like a name and a date, leads me to believe more in its truth than to doubt
it. It does have a feeling of familiarity between the writer and recipient.
Correct, yeah. And again, they were all
my dear Anderson
Masons and such, but
okay, cool.
I mean, I just think that it's perfectly possible for someone to truly believe the relative did it, and
Right.
and that may still not be evidence, because you have sort of relations of Patricia Cornwall's favourite suspect, Sickert, who are convinced that he did it too, and we may or may not take that as actual evidence, just as the fact that one of the investigators said he felt that was the person, again, may not be conclusive. I mean, my personal feeling is that it's quite a strong suspect, just because at least the murders did coincide with his death, and the history of insanity and all that kind of stuff. I didn't think that he could have killed Annie Chapman, because I thought he was playing cricket, but as you rightly say, the train times would have allowed him to get back for the match.
And can you explain to me where exactly Blackheath is in relation to the East End? Is Blackheath, would you consider that like a suburb of London, or what would you consider Blackheath?
Well, now it's a suburb of London because London's so built out. It's southeast of London, so if you walk directly south of Whitechapel and cross the Thames at London Bridge, and then continue on south, but a little southeast, it's maybe, God, I don't want to put it in miles because I'll probably get it horribly wrong. But by train, it's not far. I mean, it's maybe like a sort of 15-minute train ride. So it's
even at the time,
it's not far. No, it's not far. It's very doable.
And I guess I should say he did have his barrister offices were within walking distance of Whitechapel, though there are problems with that. But
in fairness, everybody's barrister's offices are with walking distance of Whitechapel, because Whitechapel is like a 25-minute walk east of the law courts. But yeah.
Say James Maybrick or something. We did not have offices in walking distance of Whitechapel. But I think, and I think there's a part of me that thinks Druitt is just a very sad person, but
yeah,
but I like him a lot as a client, as a suspect.
Yeah, my gut feeling is not even like trying very hard to get rid of any prejudice I have about not wanting to believe a posh person could do such a thing. Is there's enough other shall we say, possible motives for his behavior and death that have nothing to do with the murders. And that, as was already mentioned, that at this time there was a lot of hysteria going on around the murders. It was on everyone's mind. Everyone was talking about it. And that people who did have a strange family member might be inclined to become suspicious, especially if he died around this time. But apparently he was dismissed from his job right around that time. So it may be...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and there's some speculation that he may have been gay. Or, at the very least, the mental health problems may have led to his firing. And that would have potentially been enough to push him over the edge. It was just coincidence that this was all happening during the Ripper murders. I mean, we have to remember that they were not happening in a vacuum. There was just tons of other things going on in London, in England at that time.
Exactly, which is why I need more than a family member saying it and a bit of mental illness in the family. But I do at least like the fact that he dies because I mean some of these people were, they're still alive years later, and you think, how does an escalating serial killer suddenly just stop but carry on living?
I'll give you that.
And I might want subconsciously for it to be a posh suspect too. I don't think that I'm immune from that. Slightly disappointed if it was a poor, dirty, listening to voices in his head guy. That it's not quite as romantic, and that's a shitty thing to say about the murder of people.
But you're right.
But you're right.
Jack the Ripper has been incredibly romanticized over the years into this almost Byronic hero. And I think people really want him to be, posher than he probably was.
Yeah.
But, I think that Jack the Ripper bears an enormous weight of expectation, and we need to have a suspect who lives up to that. It's kind of humiliating if you spent decades and now centuries wondering about the serial killer and he turns out to be just another nutcase, right? So, I mean, I think this case, that's why I love the Ripper, because it says so much about us as a fan culture as well. I mean,
It does.
For better and worse.
Yeah, and I would just say,
anything else you want to say about him?
I mean, I think it's sure. I just want to say about homosexuality thing. I mean, I think that's where our mind kind of naturally goes when we hear of an adult teacher master at a boys' boarding school was, got into serious trouble and was let go. But I'd caution against that. But again, maybe that's just because I like Druitt as a suspect, and I think it would be very uncommon, and maybe we'll get to this when we talk about Tumblety. But for a homosexual serial killer to kill women in kind of in this manner,
absolutely,
I think it has happened.
I mean,
these seem like sexual crimes to me. So I think it would be unlikely that if Druitt was a homosexual, which is certainly a possibility, that he was the victim, or that he was the suspect.
Yeah, I do believe other serial killers who did have primarily male victims were, at least closeted homosexuals or bisexual, or that they were going after the victims for a sexual reason. And I personally don't believe that Tumblety was gay, but we'll get to Tumblety and my thoughts about him when we get to him. Yeah, I don't think he was gay, but we'll get there.
Well, do you want to do Tumblety next? I mean, it's a nice segue.
Sure. Well, I mean, do we want to try to? Okay.
I think it'd be wise to just knock out the McNaughton memorandum in order, if that makes sense.
Sure,
I don't know.
let's do
Maybe
that.
we should save Kosminski for last. I don't know what makes the most sense.
No, let's go ahead and finish the memorandum. Who wants to talk about the next guy in the memorandum?
I think Michael Ostrog
Tom,
is...
do you want to take that?
I think it's the weakest, but yeah, let's see if FT Wood has something good to say.
No, I'm mostly a Druitt guy, so I'm pretty up on... My understanding on Ostrog, I'll just read from the McNaughton memorandum if I can find it here. Let's see. Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor and a convict who was subsequently detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. The man's antecedents were of the worst possible type, and his whereabouts at the time of the murders could never be ascertained. My understanding is that in the 100+ years, his locations at the time of the murders has been ascertained, and he was in France during the entire autumn of 1888. Is that a misunderstanding on my part, or is that...
Yeah, I think that's been proved. I mean, certainly for the Mary Kelly murder, and yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that he was a very unpleasant figure and probably mentally unwell, but sadly he just doesn't fit the bill for this one.
Seemed to be a con man and a thief, and there are certainly serial murderers who do those kinds of things, but he doesn't hold up very well for me, and I question, even if this is the best three that they came up with, how he even made the top three, because he doesn't seem like a very credible suspect to me.
I completely agree.
I guess I'm
But
curious.
Would you dismiss him?
I would. I'm not super up to date on the latest Michael Ostrog stuff, but my understanding is that he's got an alibi that's pretty ironclad.
On to Kosminski.
Yes, I actually just read a whole book about him, making a case for him being the Ripper. So he's probably in my top three, to be honest.
He's my number one suspect, I have to admit.
So Bina, did you want to just do a little rundown of Kosminski?
Well, the reason why I like Kosminski as a potential suspect is that I think that despite our need for a sort of romantic hero or anti-hero, he is the guy. He is just the sort of faceless immigrant who is very, very mentally unwell, who has been in and out of asylums, who suffers from hallucinations, who hears the voices. So the classic serial killer, and that he would have fitted the pattern of escalation and then apparently was put in an asylum, and that's when the murders would have come to an end. And I think, less charitably towards myself, one of the reasons I like to think it's him is that it puts the police in a good light. In other words, they knew who did it, and they didn't admit it to people because they didn't want to inflame anti-Semitism. So if you want to have a sort of a noble motivation to the cops, then that would be it.
Except that they, in their memoirs, said it was a Polish Jew who they refused to name and stuff like that. So
yeah, but in a slightly different environment, though. In fairness,
I guess so.
In a very, it's slightly different to say that because I don't think England was, well, I'm not saying that there wasn't anti-Semitism in England at the time, but it certainly wasn't the level that you would have seen in various continental European countries. I mean, we'd had a prime minister called Israeli more than once at this period. So, but I think, to have said that it was a Polish Jew at the time, I think would have been really inflammatory. And I guess, you can or cannot place weight on the fact that Sir Robert Anderson thought it was him. I mean, Abberline has his suspect. This is the suspect Kosminski has. But to me, it's really about the fact that he just fits the serial killer profile, and that he was in the area, he was there for the murders, and that there's a plausible reason for why the murders stop. So, all circumstantial.
Well, I would say that if you believe that it was an escalating serial killer, that Kosminski doesn't go into the asylum, I don't believe, until 1890 or 1891. I think 2 years after the Mary Kelly murder. So the notion that I think Anderson, or maybe it's Swanson, but that they put out that he was institutionalized and then the murder stopped is not accurate. I mean, it's truthful, but it's not a cause and effect. The murder stopped, and then 2 years later he was institutionalized.
Yeah, there is that bit of a time gap issue, but at the same time, like the book we were mentioning, Case for the Scotland Yard's Prime Suspect, he does seem like the accounts we do have of him, his life, his family's background, it does seem to fit a general serial killer profile.
Yeah, I think there's I would say there's a lot less known even about Kosminski than there is about Druitt, and that we tend to fill in, obviously, some things that may or may not be true with him. We certainly don't have any evidence that he had the quote-unquote great hatred of women or the prostitute class or strong homicidal tendencies. Those things are not, they might be true. There might have been evidence when McNaughton wrote that or when the investigation was ongoing, but none of that survives to us. So
it's also fair to say that at the time, given sexual prejudices, just the fact that you're caught masturbating once or twice can be enough to get you committed to an asylum. And the fact that people at the time judged him to be like mentally unwell doesn't necessarily mean that he was. I think he was probably.
Well, he's yes. I mean, he seems to have heard voices, and by the end, by 1889 or 1890, when he's eating food out of the gutter and he's refusing to bathe and stuff like that. Now, I haven't read it's been a while since I read that Robert House book, but isn't he arrested for refusing to muzzle a dog or something? Like in 1889, and I believe he seems to be at that time pretty coherent, so that there might have been a pretty quick onset of kind of incoherence, and I'm not an expert on mental illness, but that he may have been, even though what we know of him from the colony hatch records and stuff, he may have been in the autumn of 1888. He might have been perfectly capable and cunning and able to think clearly and coherently.
Is it possible for serial killers, when they've gone through the escalation phase, if assuming they're schizophrenic and whatever, but is it possible for them to sort of snap back and go into a kind of lucid, almost normal phase for a couple of years and then like not be aware of that, or is that not plausible?
It all depends on what their major malfunction is, to be honest.
I agree. I believe that's true. I mean, I think like the BTK serial killer, just quit killing people because he didn't want to get caught,
Yeah, and
So
he had
I
a
think,
somewhat normal life.
yeah, I mean, he had, exactly.
I I actually think about him in relation to Jack the Ripper a lot, to be honest, because just that thought of someone who did have the capacity to do these things, but then also to stop when he quote unquote needed to.
Yes, it's. I think it's hard for our minds to understand how these things would work, but I don't know that I would necessarily subscribe to the escalation theory. So I would say that the wounds and stuff were generally dictated by his opportunity, how much time he had with the victim, and not so much
Right.
that it's a straight line up to Mary Kelly from.
Yeah, I think that's
True
something really
enough.
important to keep in mind that yeah, it was more about, him actually able to do what he wanted to do.
And this is a very tight. This is like 3 months we're talking about where he's killing maybe 5 or 6 women. So he's clearly has a maturation process to his modus operandi, but I don't know. And again, I'm not a super expert on serial killers otherwise, but I think he's just doing what he can get away with at every time he can get away with. I don't think there's, I think it's a myth, I guess, that he's escalating his mutilations and stuff. I think he's just doing everything he can get away with each time.
Okay.
Well, in that case, then doesn't it make it more plausible? It could be someone like a Tumblety or a Kosminski that whereby he chooses for whatever reason to stop at a certain point and is then either apprehended or like a Druitt die or whatever the reason is. If you don't think he's on an escalation spiral, then it makes it more plausible that he carries on living after the murders stop.
Yes, I believe that's true.
Playing devil's advocate.
And
In
that's
which
one of the
case, does
reasons-
it matter that we've got 2 years missing for Kosminski where we don't know what he was up to?
Well, I think it goes to the detective statements that they're selling a narrative that isn't necessarily accurate. I would just say that much. That I don't want to accuse Anderson of anything, but he was in France, right, for on holiday for most of this.
Yeah, I thought Switzerland. He was sent
Switzerland,
somewhere
right.
for his health. Yeah, he was sent away for his health.
Yeah,
for
to be a little bit more
misfortune.
charitable, he didn't just go for a seaside jaunt in the south of France. He was sent to a sanitarium in Switzerland because he'd been working so hard. He was on the verge of a breakdown. So
Yeah, his health was collapsing.
Grinding out my Irishman, so I'm sure I'm supposed to feel sad for him, but
Yes, his health was collapsing in the traditional Victorian fashion. Anyway, so yeah, I think he's in. As I already said, Kosminski's in my top 3. Who do we want to do next, or did anyone want to say anything else about him?
well, do we want to say anything about the shawl and the book, the DNA stuff, or do you want to?
Yeah, let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and cover that. So this book, people may have seen the news reports about it. Recently came out with an amateur investigator claiming that there was a shawl that came into his possession that supposedly belonged to. Okay, which victim was it? Catherine Eddowes?
My understanding is that the shawl is supposed to have belonged to Kosminski, actually.
the concept is this is the wackadoodle concept.
Yeah, this is
that
hardcore.
Kosminski
Yeah,
was buying these super expensive luxury shawls and leaving them somehow by the victim as a kind of calling card. It's just bonkers.
Yeah, and this shawl, I've seen photos of it. It is not something like, okay, Catherine Eddowes, if you look at the rundown of everything that was on her person, she was like carrying all her worldly possessions with her.
Correct.
And first of all, a shawl is not listed among them, but like a lot of her stuff was described as very old or very ragged, for example, and that shawl looks like in pretty good condition. And also from the photos I saw, it was supposedly blood-stained, and I don't see any brownish discoloration on those photos at all.
And then, it's the same problem as we have with our Patricia Cornwall Sickert case. So, assuming that she did have a shawl, and
Or
assuming
Kosminski brought a shawl to the
exactly,
murders.
and assuming that that is also the authentic shawl that he has happened to buy in an auction in the east of England, and has had it DNA tested, it's still just the empty DNA that is not really narrowing things down.
Exactly. Like basically
That's
it proves that he found DNA on it. That's what it proves.
yeah. So
Yeah.
just no.
I mean, if you guys are familiar with these cases, they didn't know who these women were. They had to identify them in part by what they were wearing, what their clothing was. They had to find eyewitnesses that had seen them with what they were wearing. There's no way that a police officer is just going to say, "Hey, can I have that?" and then walk away with
Exactly.
a piece of evidence that they need to identify the victim and the murderer. And it's just not, I just don't put any credence into the provenance of the thing.
No.
And
Although if one wanted to play devil's advocate, or one could say that maybe, things have always been filched from the Ripper files.
sure, but this would
And
have been,
so one has to argue, therefore, that it's filched before it even makes it into the Ripper files, because no record is listed in the original police documents of the existence of a shawl. And you can say,
Yeah.
well, a poor Bobby on the beat, that's a very expensive shawl, take it home, wash it, and give it to the wife. I mean, I
but
don't know.
it hasn't been washed.
Exactly.
That's central to the whole thing. I mean, he could
Exactly.
have taken it as a souvenir, I guess, but it would have been, it would show very badly on him.
I can't
Yeah.
imagine that with all these letters floating about of people saying, oh, but by the way, my aunt did it, that there wasn't some letter of someone saying, oh, God, yeah, Grandad had that awesome Ripper shawl. It just strikes me as completely ludicrous and says far more about our hunger to have new evidence and to solve the case, and how
Yeah.
people can prey on that by producing very second-rate books than anything to do with solving the
Yeah,
case.
I'm very. I mean, I'm very. You have the book, Bina. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, but I would like to know who actually gathered the specimens of.
Wasn't it some university that did it?
But who actually got the descendants' blood and whatever? Because I'm very doubtful that if the author himself, not a scientist, but the author himself was the one that got the blood and saliva and the DNA from the descendants of Kosminski and Eddowes.
Yeah,
I'm
I mean,
very,
my
very suspicious of that if he's the one that
exactly.
Well,
gathered
I mean, I
the.
think the university, all they do is, if they're given two
Yeah,
samples, they'll tell you if there's a connection, but they're not responsible for the chain of evidence of how those samples were collected. So,
yeah. If they were responsible for collecting them, I'd feel a lot better that he has something that has the DNA of a contemporary suspect and potentially a contemporary suspect and potentially a victim. But I don't even think we can say that much.
Well, also Kosminski didn't have any direct descendants per se because he never had
Correct.
children. I
So
mean, we
it would
don't
have
even
been.
have evidence of him having relationships with women, period.
So it's his sister's descendants.
Yeah, okay.
but I think
So
Um,
we're all
I don't
agreed
know.
it's spurious.
Yeah, I don't know how 100% match, which is what is stated at least in the tabloid article where this whole information was introduced. 100% match is even possible with mitochondrial DNA from a relative, not even a direct descendant. But I'm no expert, but
Well, you can't, and I think that if you happen to come across evidence today, the Metropolitan Police have the case files for this case. What you would do is you would go to the Met and say, look, I've got this shawl, this is what I think, I've personally paid for this to be tested, but please take it, do proper tests, you've got the original evidence that you collected, and please tell the what, if your motives were pure, you would involve the police, you don't go straight to a tabloid newspaper.
mhm.
to be fair, the shawl was given by, I think the constable's name was Amos Simpson, was given by his family. Uh, it was in the Black Museum, so I think it was given to Scotland Yard. The Black Museum never displayed it because they frankly did not believe that it was a true relic, and it sat there for a long time was returned to the family, and then at that time the family put it up for auction where this guy bought it. That's my understanding. So the family did at some point return the shawl.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm not accusing the family. I'm accusing the author that,
Yeah.
you've then gone ahead and done this testing, and then do you not want to take it back to them and say, by the way, you rejected this. I think you need to look again at it.
And I hope we do get peer reviews of all this that's done, and if it proves out that there is that DNA legitimately from both people, then that's very important. But my understanding is the shawl is likely Edwardian, not Victorian, but again, I don't know enough to prove that that's true or not either. So
has Patricia Cornwall made any comment?
I avoid her at all costs.
Another thing, just a circumstantial sort of thing to point out, is that let's say that somehow Catherine Eddowes had come upon that shawl, she would have sold it immediately. We discussed in part one the levels of deprivation that these women were existing in. Anything of value that she didn't need would have gone towards money, which would have gone immediately towards drink. That's just the kind of lives they were living.
I think that's why he had to come up with this whole theory that Kosminski brought the shawl, because Eddowes had pawned her, I think, husband or boyfriend's, however it would have worked, his boots, I think the day before, to buy gin and stuff. And I haven't read the book, but I suspect that he had to put this shawl with Kosminski because there's no way that anyone.
Yeah, but then it's not like Kosminski was living in the lap of luxury. It's not as if he had ready cash to go and buy shawls.
His brother was a women's tailor.
Yeah, I mean.
So he filched it from the tailor. Okay.
That is what I believe is
the theory.
The theory, exactly.
Yeah. Color me unimpressed.
As I understand it.
Yeah, but I also think that those sorts of goods, because they were very much the tailoring was sustaining the immigrant community at that time, that those shops and whatnot would have been very carefully regulated. I know regulation is a funny word to use. It was
a sweatshop, and they weren't going to let people walk out with stuff.
Exactly.
But I mean, it's at least theoretically possible he could have stolen it from his brother, and I believe that's the working theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's so unlikely on so many levels. But and it kind of makes me mad because Kosminski is otherwise a really good suspect, and we don't need this kind of ridiculousness to muddy the waters.
Yeah, I appreciate that he at least picked Kosminski instead of someone absolutely ridiculous like Cornwall did.
I can't wait till we get to Sickert. But on to Tumblety. Tumblety. I love that word. It's like hullabaloo. You can just say it. Hullabaloo. It's just a lovely word.
Yeah, and I get to take him because he's my hometown boy.
You go for it.
Sort of. All right. So Francis Tumblety was actually born in Ireland, but moved to Rochester when he was a young boy, Rochester, New York, where I am from. And his whole career was sort of marked by sexual deprivation and just sort of very, very suspect things. So apparently he started his... He was a quack doctor, yeah. But I'm just going to talk about how it seems like from a very young age he was peddling and selling. Oh, sorry. Are you still here? Or do you guys hear me?
It's fine for me. But...
Oh, I'm sorry. You were breaking up a little bit for me.
Okay, sorry. I think I was leaning on my microphone or something. All right. So anyway, from a young age, he was like selling pornographic books or something along those lines, and left home when he was about 17. And started his career as a quack doctor, selling patent medicines, which of course were, absolutely nothing, basically just like colored water with, like maybe a little bit of like alcohol mixed in, and was apparently a very ostentatious, eccentric dresser, and reminds me a little bit of Emperor Emperor Norton, who was one of the great eccentrics of San Francisco. But Emperor Norton was harmless, whereas Tumblety was not. And he was also briefly implicated in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln.
Okay, so yeah, you're going to have to take us through that a little bit.
Yeah.
My understanding is that he uses a fair number of aliases in his life, and that he just had the dumb luck of picking an alias that was a person that was involved in the conspiracy. That's my understanding, to assassinate Abraham Lincoln.
The story I've read is that he knew someone who was captured along with John Wilkes Booth, and it was just a matter of, like, there was a dragnet going on and bringing in anyone who was associated with the people who were captured. Does that make sense?
I believe so.
It may have been just, a wrong place, wrong time thing, and he was released without charge. But I just think that's just a fun little factoid about him.
But that's the gorgeousness of Tumblety. He's just full of all these crazy factoids, isn't he? He's quite a character.
Yeah.
He's the kind of guy who, if there were a movie about him, it would be, played by Danny DeVito.
He's
actually 6'2", I believe. But, we'll get to that.
But never let the facts get in the way of a good.
He couldn't have been Jack the Ripper, but go ahead.
Yeah. And also, his story also reminds me a lot of H.H. Holmes, who was widely considered to be the first modern American serial killer. And I also read a much less reputable, rather believable book claiming that H.H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper, which I just don't think there's anything to that. But just for the sake of my own edification, I read it. So anyway, Tumblety, he made a lot of money through his scams, and he really hated women. I'm just going to read directly from.
I just had this Tom Lehrer. He loved his mother. Sorry.
Yes. So Tumblety appeared to revel in denouncing all women, but reserved a special hatred for prostitutes. He blamed his misogyny on a failed marriage to a prostitute. And
there's no evidence of that marriage, by the way. But I don't think it ever existed. I don't think he ever got married. But go ahead.
Do you think he really didn't like women?
I think he liked men.
I still think that I personally don't think that he was gay. I think that he was a genuine misogynist who just wanted to stick it somewhere, and he didn't want to stick it in a woman to get crude.
So he wasn't gay. He just really, really, really didn't want to fuck women. That is a new one.
I know it sounds dumb. It sounds dumb now that I've got it out and said it. Now that I've sort of aired it out into the light of day. But
yeah, VOK is a safe place. It's the safe, reassuring place we can all utter the dumb things we think.
I think it's smart.
It's like this kind of like weird Georges Bataille kind of theory that he just needs to create some other hole to fuck, but it's not the fact that it's a man that's the material point.
I think there's a fair amount of evidence that he enjoyed the company of men. I think that there's a long string of he would hire attractive male secretaries and then proposition them. Like take them out of the country, and I think it's fairly to me from what we have. He's arrested numerous times. He's for homosexual acts. He's blackmailed. I think in New Orleans at one point by a gang that targeted gay men. But they picked the fight with Tumblety, and of course he's kind of a badass, and the gay badass kind of that they tried to blackmail him.
Tumblety the gay badass. I mean, it's
he of course took them to court and said, go ahead. He I think Little Child in the kind of famous Little Child letter lays out that he was gay and he was arrested for homosexual acts in London during the autumn of 1888.
But isn't the key point in the Little Child letter where he says that Tumblety was not a sadist?
I think that's I or he was not. He says he was not known as, but I think there's no evidence that I found that Tumblety ever really was violent in any way. He's got a lot of run-ins with the law, a lot of them involved with soliciting men, and kind of the fallout from that. But I don't think there's anything about him that is. He's kind of as you said, a ostentatious character. He's a quack and he's a self-promoter. I just don't see him, to me, as having. And I guess you make the comparison with Holmes, and there is some similarities there, I guess. But I don't see him. But Holmes killed mostly for profit. But I don't see him being a sexual serial killer. Of women. I just don't see it adding up.
I revised my theory. He could have been gay, but he also could have hated women. Not mutually exclusive. Could have been both.
True.
Well,
but also, I just feel with a lot of these suspects, like, Kosminski, he masturbated, pervert,
Yeah.
Tumblety, homosexual, it was a period in which people did jump from one thing to another all too easily.
I think the police were looking for some very specific things. I think they were looking for medical knowledge, which Tumblety is quote unquote a doctor, but he's a quack. He has no actual surgical or medical training. I think. But
that's the key point, right? He doesn't have anatomical knowledge. He knows how to mix up a dodgy looking cordial.
He doesn't even know how to do that. He outsources those things, because when he's arrested for stuff, he goes to the chemist that actually made them to get himself acquitted. But I think they were looking for people that were sexually
deviant, quote unquote.
Deviant, exactly, perfect. Deviant, whatever that meant to them at the time. They were looking for
suspects.
People, pedophiles, perhaps with Druitt, homosexuals, masturbators, people that they viewed, a Victorian society viewed as sexually deviant. They were looking for people with anatomical knowledge.
And that's the thing, isn't it? This list of suspects tells us far more about Victorian sexual mores than it does about actually who killed these poor women.
The little child letter is unbelievable. I don't know if you want to quote from it, but when he's talking about Oscar Wilde and stuff, it says more about little child than the Ripper murders, obviously.
But I guess one has to remember, in the context of the time, this is the period of, the Oscar Wilde trial and incredible hysteria about homosexuality and incredible hysteria about moral decay, which I've always found the late Victorian era very strange in this respect.
It's very interesting time period for me as well. Just the kind of the contrast and the hypocrisy of it all.
Absolutely, and I guess that's, in a way, to me, that's the attraction of Ripper, because not because I care who actually did it or think we'll ever actually know. And of course I have great sympathy for the victims, but just because I think it sort of crystallizes all sorts of strange currents that were happening socially at the time, and it's just an interesting lens through which to get back into this very bizarre world.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And also, like I said, Tumblety was 6'2", and there are, all of the kind of reliable, quote-unquote, eyewitness accounts put the Ripper at somewhere around 5'7" or 5'6" or so. And there's really the only kind of eyewitness account that matches Tumblety at all is closely related to the From Hell letter. I don't know if you guys know the...
Oh, no. Okay.
The From Hell letter was sent to...
was it not sent to George...
Committee?
Yeah, to George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee.
So, in Whitechapel, the Vigilance Committee had a poster in the window of a shop of I can't find her. I think her name was Mary Evans, and a 6 foot, a tall. God, I can't find her name, but a tall person, kind of wearing a military uniform, a Prussian uniform, which is what Tumblety wears. He got arrested actually for wearing a uniform he didn't earn, but a 6 foot tall person came into her shop and asked for the day before the letter, then the package was received, asked for if she had the Vigilance Committee's address. She didn't have it, but she went to a newspaper and gave him the address from that. which he took down in a notebook, and it was an address without the street number, and that's exactly the way that the kidney and the letter arrived the next day.
But again, I mean, surely, even if that proves Tumblety sent the letter, it's not certain that he didn't do that on a lark. I mean, that could be unrelated to the letter.
But the kidney is, for me, that's the only letter that means anything. And if Tumblety could be linked to that letter, we don't know. We don't know if the kidney was actually Eddowes' kidney or not, and we'll never know. But that's the only thing that I found that even looks like it could put Tumblety involved. And Tumblety seems to have been followed pretty strictly while he was in London. I assume because he, as you say, he was an Irish American of wealth, and he seems to have been.
Well, he was a known criminal.
Well, I don't think. I don't know that he was a criminal. And that's, in a meaningful 21st century way.
But it's worth considering that by the standards of the time, he would have been seen as dodgy, and he was followed, and therefore I think it's even more unlikely he committed the murders, because I just think he was one of those people that the police always had an eye on. Yeah. I just think he was just one of these guys who had a very colourful life, and wrong time, wrong place. There were just certain sort of overlaps with behaviours they were looking for, and his name's ended up on a list, and basically he probably was a bit unpleasant, bit of a con man. He probably was gay, but I don't think there's any evidence that he was violent towards people. Taking your secretary on a nice holiday and propositioning him is rather embarrassing for the poor secretary, but, there's no evidence. There's no one who's ever reported that he held them up with a knife and, was physically abusive in demands for sex. So, and that was directed as men anyway. So yeah.
The only is the collection of uteruses, which again I think is pretty sketchy, whether that's even true. But there is a accusation in the press at the time that he had a collection of female uterus. I guess female uteruses is.
Or just other just preserved organs. Uteri, you can say uteri.
Uteri, and that the uterus of, I forget which victim was removed in...
A couple, actually. I think it was Annie Chapman. Well, the point is that there was one victim who the uterus was missing, and the claim was that it had been removed surgically, and that the theory that I had read was that it may have been removed post-mortem by someone working in the morgue to be sold as a medical specimen, and that it wasn't necessarily removed by the killer.
And you probably covered that, but I believe Annie Chapman's mutilations were not noticed at the crime scene. They were only noticed after she was brought to the mortuary. So there is some doubt as to where those mutilations took place. I think it's just that they just missed it because they weren't looking for ripped up women at that time yet. Mm-hmm. And that I think her skirts were put back down over her. But again, she was found by like two workmen or something, and I believe they said that they did that, but it didn't reach the police. So her wounds were not, other than her throat, were not cataloged at the crime scene itself.
Right. So just what I just wanted to say there was that there was some evidence that the killer was trying to get at the reproductive organs. Also, there's the possibility that that wasn't the case at all, and that it was someone was using it as an opportunity to sell them on the black medical market. So that's all I want to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so sounds like there's no one really backing Tumblety.
Well, not anymore.
He's a super interesting guy. Again, I think he's sad. If you look at there's a book, I think it's called like The Prince of Quacks, about Tumblety. It's just a biography. But if his life is just sad as a look at kind of homosexuality in the Victorian area, and how he's just so difficult for him, obviously with no, the finding willing mates was difficult for this guy, and that his life is just kind of a sad testimony to that.
But he is today buried in one of the major Catholic cemeteries, if not the major Catholic cemetery in Rochester, New York, Holy Sepulchre. I never visited his grave, though I have been to that cemetery. So I guess we can close the proverbial coffin lid on him. So the next guy is George Chapman,
a.k.a. Severin Klazowski.
Mm-hmm.
Abeline's favourite suspect.
Yeah.
And do we respect Abeline? What's your view, FT Ward?
I don't have great respect for him. I mean, I hate to say that. I respect him. I don't know if you talked about Mary Kelly's murder, but
yeah, we did.
He put great stock into the witness of Mary Kelly's. I forget his name. Was it the guy that was hanging around Mary Kelly's room that whole night? He put great stock into his testimony, and I just find it incredible. I mean, he was making such detailed descriptions of a suspect that just weren't possible in my mind, in the darkness and so I respect him as a detective. I think he's kind of, we get a lot of different, like the Johnny Depp version is kind of ridiculous. But,
in fairness to Abeline, though, I think, we're now in the modern world trained to believe that witnesses are very unreliable, and that actually the more accurate the description, the more likely it is they're making shit up very either consciously or subconsciously to impress or to feel winning. And at the time he was probably like, finally someone with some kind of specific memory. So I kind of give Abeline a free pass in that respect, I think. But he was European head of Pinkerton's when he retired, so he evidently wasn't a schmuck. And he was one of the for what it's worth, from a low baseline, he was one of the few people on the case who actually had a background in dealing with crime as we would understand it. Like, he wasn't some parachuted in political appointee. He had actually walked the streets and dealt with actual criminals, which surprisingly few of the policemen had.
Yeah, so I respect him as a detective, but I have my doubts that that a lot of his statements shouldn't hold extra value, I guess.
Do we want to say something about George Chapman?
Yeah. Let's see.
So again, a Polish immigrant, surgical training. And he eventually was hanged in America, is that right? In 1903, I don't know too much about it.
He poisoned a series of wives. Again, it seems to me for financial gain, which is again very different. Kind of the cold, calculated poison of a wife, as opposed to the kind of frenzied murder of a stranger, is a very different crime. I don't necessarily think the same person couldn't do both, but
doesn't seem likely.
But again, in my limited, it doesn't fit for me.
Yeah.
Plus, I don't know. I have doubts that he was in when he emigrated. Do we know when he emigrated to London? I feel like he wasn't the best English speaker, even later in life, and that it would have been very questionable that he would have been able to converse. I mean, we have a couple of instances where people actually, witnesses heard the Ripper, quote unquote, and it just doesn't fit for me.
Yeah, to me, the biggest evidence against Chapman is, I mean, whether or not we think the serial killer, the Ripper, escalated, but ultimately, can someone de-escalate into a domestic poisoner for cash?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's
the biggest thing.
Yeah, that's another big reason why I didn't believe the crackpot theory about H.H. Holmes. But
yeah, it just feels like a completely different a very rational, coldly motivated crime for financial gain is not the same as someone who rips. So yeah.
I agree. I think they just looked at people that killed women and that were in London in 1888 and said, oh, well, he could be the Ripper, or he was the Ripper, or you've got your man. But I think we know there's more at play in the psychology of serial killers now
Absolutely.
than they did then. And for me, again, I'm no expert. It just doesn't add up to me.
Which brings us, speaking of things not quite adding up, to the bonkers suspects.
Yay!
Who wants to make the case for Walter Sickert?
Oh, I think whoever dislikes Patricia Cornwall the most.
Well, I guess that's...
I think that's F.T. Ward, right?
Because I wanna do the Prince Albert Victor one. So.
Okay.
Sure. So I mean, I dislike Patricia Cornwall the most. Sickert is someone that's floated around the Ripper crimes for a very long time before Patricia Cornwall ever came in and started spending her money. But again, he's kind of a nasty person, I think. And even if you can link, which I think you really can't, even if you can link tangentially his DNA to a stamp of a letter, which clearly had nothing to do with the killer, it's a pretty sad case. And she's just a very condescending person. And I'm not generally... I generally don't dislike people as strongly as I dislike her, but her case for Sickert is pretty weak, and she pretends she invented or discovered all this stuff that has been around and dismissed by legitimate researchers a long time ago.
I think the psychology of Sickert's really fascinating. And I think the problem is she should have just written a really interesting book about Sickert. I mean, he was an upper class Englishman. He was close friends with royalty, and he was a sadistic voyeur. He did have a particular condition that would maybe make him feel quite bitter towards women and sexualize women. He did.
But
go,
is that
he
even
did go
true?
to the. He did go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is documented and true. He did go to the East End. He did paint pictures of prostitutes and of murder victims and all that kind. And to me, what's interesting about Sickert is that he epitomizes the posh West End voyeurism that was and condescension that was taking place at the time, where these very expensive sort of rich people would go to the East End and sort of like gloat and be voyeurs at the despicable depravity that was the East End. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if Sickert, who was a shameless publicist and a mischief maker and loved having aliases, did try and sort of hint at dark, malevolent links to the Ripper case. He was exactly the kind of tosser who would have done that. But we don't have to believe his hype, do we? And we don't have to believe that he was actually the Ripper on the basis of apparently some writing paper and apparently some DNA, which doesn't narrow it down and doesn't coincide with dates. So I think Sickert's really fascinating, and like the Ripper case, sums up all sorts of... He's at the absolute heart of that juncture between, the posh and the deprived in the East End. But the fact that the idea that he's the Ripper is just appalling. And the idea that Patricia Cornwall would pretend that she has great links high up in the Met, and the Met entertain her and almost like Hercule Poirot consult with her because she's such a great crime novelist and allow her to go off and do some DNA testing is just laughable.
Yeah, there's
Rant
also...
over.
Well, I was going to say there's also this issue that the Sickert theory, such as it is, hinges on the notion that he had some kind of deformity on his penis, and then, but at the same time, he had a son. So it kind of seems like, those two things may be a little bit incompatible. That if maybe he wasn't even capable of having, sex in the conventional way, that he could have fathered a child. So that's another strike against it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, just to sort of round that out, even if there's absolutely nothing wrong with his childbearing capacity and whatever, because he did draw and paint an awful lot of pictures of people getting mutilated and cut up and all sorts of nasty shit being done to them, right? So this is a guy who had who took an interest, at the very least, in defense.
Very much so. I think some of his paintings are very much open for interpretation, though, as to whether what they're portraying is violence or the aftermath of violence, or if they're portraying something else. And I think he was playing with that, and I think he was. I'm sure you talked about this in the letter stuff, but the kind of person, and there were hundreds of them that wrote these kinds of letters, but none of that puts him in London at the time, and none of that makes him the Ripper.
Mm-hmm.
And if it was him, why did he stop? he alleges that he then went to France and started ripping there, right? But come on, the Ripper case got so much international notoriety. Do you not think that people would have made the links? Oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, and also, I mean, he was a man of such notoriety that do you not think people would have linked them to him? I mean, he's not a guy who could have hidden in plain sight.
Do you think a lot of these quote-unquote suspects simply are known to us because they were characters in their day, and that they were just known people?
Well, I think that the kind of author that's going to make a suspect book and kind of hinge their thing is going to find a character which there's enough known about that they can, like with Maybrick or with Sickert, that they can that they have enough information. Obviously, if you write a book about a nobody, you're not going to, I mean, like a Feigenbaum, but it's hard to find information. It's hard to kind of put any dots there to even connect. So I think if you're writing a suspect book, which are generally, I find, the worst kinds of Ripper books, that you have to find someone that has a certain cachet to begin with before you kind of hoist the Ripper onto them.
I completely agree. And actually, I think when I opened the Paul Begg book that I recommended to you, Julia, the reason why I respected it when I opened up the book is that almost the first sentence is this. He says that, look, in this book I'm just going to give you some of the facts as we know them and tell you when we don't know them, and I just want to tell you right now, I'm not going to give you the name of a favourite suspect because we don't know, and we probably will never know. So close the book now if that's the kind of book you think this is. And
what was the name of the author again? I'm sorry.
Paul Begg, and I immediately thought, okay, fine, we're in good territory now.
B-E-R-G?
B-E-G-G.
Yeah. That Ripper cast that I mentioned earlier, he's a frequent guest on there, and he's excellent.
Yeah, he's so when I laid out the suspects in the show notes, I've just basically taken his list of suspects, and he says, look, these are the pros, these are the cons, this is the historical context of why they were picked, and he just absolutely says, like, we'll never know. It's very unlikely we'll ever know. But yeah.
So is the book called Jack the Ripper: The Facts?
The fact book, yeah. And it literally is, it's very short actually. It just says, this is exactly what we know, this is, and more importantly, what we don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, he also believes that none of the letters are true, except maybe from Hal.
Yeah, that's pretty much the consensus.
Yeah. And he also believes in the canonical five.
Did we want to move on to the royal conspiracy?
Oh, you go for it.
I think
please
we must.
Be gentle with me.
Okay. All right. So this is, oh man, this is a great one. It was not really proposed until, I do believe, like the 60s, as this great royal conspiracy that someone connected to the royal family, either one of Queen Victoria, because Queen Victoria reigned for so long that a number of her grandchildren reached adulthood while she was still reigning. So there were all these royal princes and princesses running around.
Just and like Walter Frey.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, but not as much of a jerk as him. So anyway, it was one of her grandsons, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale. By the way, she tried to make like all her kids name their sons Albert, like give them that as their first name, because as we know, she wasn't just in love with her late husband; she was obsessed with him. I'm convinced that if Queen Victoria had access to birth control, she would have had maybe like 2 kids max until she got to like the requisite, heir and spare, and then would have just stopped having kids, but just done nothing but have sex with out there randomly. Says that either the prince was responsible, or also implicates one of the royal physicians, Hull. What was his first name? Crap.
Sir William Gall.
Gull, that's right. He was one of the royal physicians, or the royal physician, or also another young man, this James Kenneth Stephen, who was a friend of Albert Victor's. So one way or another, it just is trying to put this on some grand royal conspiracy. And this is what this theory was popularized by first the graphic novel From Hell, and then the movie that came out few years back, and unfortunately, I think a lot of people who like know about Jack the Ripper but haven't looked into it, they might believe this, you know.
Yeah.
So that's unfortunate. But well, these were very interesting people. And like there's sort of like different offshoots of the royal theory, but one of them goes that Albert Victor had married a prostitute and that had a child with her, and that in order to hush this whole scandal up, the royal physician was going around murdering everyone that knew about the child's existence.
Well, the material point is not just that he got married to a whore and had a child, but that the whore was Catholic. So
Yes.
it feeds into the sort of the Fenian sort of hysteria of the time. And I think, in fairness to this theory, I mean, he probably was syphilitic, and he probably did die of tertiary syphilis, right? So he probably was quite mental by the end. But
I think
yeah.
she was a shop girl. I don't know that she was a prostitute either, but I guess this doesn't really matter. Defend her.
Are we still talking about Albert Victor? Because there's also pretty good evidence that he was gay.
He was implicated in the Cleveland Street scandal, wasn't
Yes.
he? But he could have been
Yes.
bisexual, in fairness.
Yeah. Well, he died very young. He was only 28 when he died. So it's, in a way, he's like a perfect crackpot suspect, because you have someone who kind of didn't live long enough to prove, just the same way with Druitt, they didn't live long enough to prove anyone otherwise, so to speak.
But yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, this theory I think has a lot of appeal because people always love a royal connection and they love talking shit about the royals, but it's just there's so many things that do not add up. Very broad strokes. Apparently, like if you want to believe that the prince was responsible, apparently there's lots of records that show he was nowhere near Whitechapel on the nights of the murders. And this idea of Gull being responsible, he was an old man at the time of the murders who had already suffered one stroke.
He was in a Masonic frenzy that gave him adrenaline-fueled power.
Yeah, and he had the Masonic connection too. It goes into like Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code, which the moment anyone says Masons or Illuminati or anything like that, like my brain just shuts down because it all just leads to lizard people, and it's so patronizing.
I think the real tragedy of the whole the final solution and this theory is that, of course, you get the movie and that's what, the average person knows and therefore they think it's true. But if you actually read the graphic novel, the appendices are so richly researched and detailed. Alan Moore's picked the most exciting story to tell, but he's very clear that he thinks, this is just a work of fiction, a work of imagination, and he gives you details of things like Paul Begg and people disproving it. So it's not his fault, but it kind of is. It's just so compelling.
I think the royal conspiracy is for me is their entry into Jack the Ripper kind of ripperology. I mean, I saw probably in like 78 or 79, I saw the In Search of Jack the Ripper, which is mostly based on the Final Solution book. And that's, when I was 8 or 9 years old, that's how I got into Jack the Ripper to begin with. And I think that's a lot of people's entrance. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people just stop there and assume that it's true when it's just complete bunk, as you've kind of laid out. There's really, it's ridiculous. And Alan Moore's book is amazing, but like you said, he's using it as a lens to look at the Victorian era and the birth of the 20th century. He's not seriously putting Gull forward as the Ripper.
And actually, it's a real shame because if you think of the Alan Moore project and the way in which, not that he did the drawings, but the way in which they took original photographs, they've really taken so much effort in that graphic novel to depict exactly the locales of the murders, to show us as modern readers the depravity, the poverty, and he goes to painful degrees to show that these women were bloated with gin, that they weren't these attractive Hollywood actresses, bodice, with boobs spilling over their corsets, and
it's not a roller girl with an Irish accent.
Exactly, with an attempt at an Irish accent. So I just find it really sad that although it's a flight of fantasy he's created, there was a very earnest social message underneath it, which is look at these poor people and look at the privilege above and the disconnect between the two, and it just gets lost. It gets lost in everyone saying, but of course, didn't Queen Victoria order a cover-up?
But I mean, Shakespeare is the same way, right? It's not true history what Shakespeare is giving us. He's telling us a story.
No, it's Tudor propaganda.
Yeah. His stuff was written specifically to make whoever ancestors were still in favor look good. Hence the way we think about Richard III up until very recently.
I think you'll have to listen to the War of the Roses podcast where I make an impassioned defense of Richard III.
I've actually downloaded that. I'll listen to that at some point this week. I read the book about the investigation into finding his grave, and I'm definitely converted to being a Richard apologist for sure.
Yeah.
So I think we can dismiss the royal theory as sort of the holy blood, holy grail of ripperology.
Indeed. But James Maybrick, who wants to talk about him? Because that's a new one for me.
Well, I just put it in there in light of the new book that came out. The Maybrick Diary, I think, came out in the early 90s. I don't know. It purported to be the diary of Jack the Ripper, and it put James Maybrick, who is a semi-famous Liverpool cotton merchant, who was, I believe, either murdered by his wife or not murdered by his wife, depending on who you believe. But he was a famous murder victim, I'm just going to say that he was killed by his wife, and it was, I think, it's generally considered a modern forgery that came out again in the early 90s, purporting to solve the Jack the Ripper case by putting it on Maybrick. But the diary's pretty. First of all, it's kind of in a ledger book, and just in the back where the front pages are torn out. It's I think there's nothing about it that adds anything new or unknown. It's just kind of parroting what we know about Jack the Ripper and putting it on Maybrick, and I don't think it holds up. And I think the author of the book has confessed to forging it numerous times and then going back on his confession. I don't know where it actually stands now, how he feels about it, but
per the sort of Paul Begg books, now this comes back to me, I think as of 1995 he had confessed, so and had described how he counterfeited it. So as someone who lived through the publication of the Hitler Diaries by the Sunday Times and that scandal, I just feel that anytime I get a hand-delivered manuscript that solves all the questions, I mean, I just think, no, disbelieve on sight. But it shows, I think it does show, actually, like, the fluidity between the bonkers suspects and then our next topic, which is the Ripper in popular culture. That
I think
it's self-feeding, isn't it? It's just very circular.
Yeah, which is why I think I wanted to insert here as the last bonkers suspect, H.H. Holmes, who
yes, please do.
Yeah, so I recently read this book called, appropriately enough, Dr. H.H. Holmes and the Whitechapel Ripper, which now I really don't think there's anything to the theory, but basically it says that H.H. Holmes, who was another quack doctor and a serial murderer, was actually Jack the Ripper. And the idea is that, basically that he was killing these women to try to sell their skeletons, which is apparently something he did with other. Actually, it's never really made clear why he thinks that he was killing, or if he was like. There's not a very strong case for Holmes being in London at the time of the murders, or for him having any kind of motive. So should not. He
absolutely did. He absolutely did sell the skeletons of some of his murder victims in Chicago. that was part of his. I mean, he had an industry,
Yeah.
basically a factory going, where he,
Yeah,
you know.
but there's.
But again, my understanding. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that again, that was a factory, and I see absolutely no indication for the Jack the Ripper killings being done with that kind of a goal in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how. I mean, I guess there are, as we said, that there are organs missing on some of the victims, but my understanding is, and I haven't read I think, Bina, you've read The Devil in the White City, or no?
Yes.
No.
Yes, I've read it.
It's on my list.
Yeah. But my understanding is that he was in Chicago in 1888 overseeing the construction of the castle.
His murder castle.
And that if you know the story behind that construction, that he is very hands-on, that he drew the blueprints, that he directed the work crews, that he was hiring and firing them regularly, that he would have had to. That's my understanding. I haven't read the book in a while, but in 1888 he could not have been in London.
Indeed. Right. But yet another fascinating figure, as many of them are, that coalesce around Jack.
Yeah, and his motive for killing, again, as we've mentioned, was financial. He was apparently a really great con man, and one of his standard ways of operating was to take out life insurance policies on people and then conveniently make them disappear, and do all sorts of insurance fraud. And another reason why this one book I just read that I just mentioned is the author just continuously refers to H.H. Holmes as like the devil incarnate and like the most evil man. And it's just like, calm down, dude.
He was, to be fair, he was pretty evil, but yeah.
Oh yeah,
I think as we said, any book that starts with a suspect and then fits the facts or discounts certain facts when they don't work are the worst kinds of books that you should. Yeah. If you're interested in the subject, you should stick to the books. Well, they're fun to read, I guess, but you should definitely stick to the books that are based on only the history and the facts.
Well, and also that sort of book you just described, inevitably they always say in the preface, we're not going to do that. We're not going to start with we're going to look at the facts and figure out who fits it best. And it's just like, you obviously had this person in mind the whole time. Which is why now I'm really excited about this other book that you just mentioned, Bina. So I can't wait to look into that. I guess, are there any other really good oddball suspects out there?
I mean, I guess just as a closing comment, we should say that practically anyone who is interesting and alive in this period has been mentioned.
Lewis Carroll and I mean.
And usually it's because they did something that the Victorians thought was perverted, but that we probably don't. Although I can't wait to do a Lewis Carroll podcast.
And I guess there's Jill the Ripper is kind of a suspect that some people.
Yeah, the mad abortionist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
no, I think we can move on because we could spend another 2 hours talking about all the random crackpot potential suspects.
Okay, so the Jack's legacy in popular culture. So we've already talked about From Hell being sort of the biggest pop culture example of ripperology.
I think it's the most recent. Yeah, I think like the Lodger stories or something that's kind of been there, even contemporary, and then there's been different versions.
Mm-hmm. What's Lulu? I'm not familiar with that. I'm reading this off the show notes.
Okay, well, Lulu started off as an opera, I'm trying to think now, Albenberg, I guess, written maybe 20, 30 years after the Ripper crimes, and it's about a promiscuous young girl called Lulu who seduces men, but comes to a sticky end when she is a victim of Jack the Ripper. And I just put that on the list to show that almost, very soon the Ripper was being put into opera, which was the popular music form of its day. And then that, of course, became a very famous black and white film starring Louise Brooks, who was the most famous movie star of her day. And if anyone here is a fan of movie history, then you should try it. I think it's available for free on the BFI iPlayer, which is the British Film Institute iPlayer. And the scene in which she's killed by the Ripper is just absolutely chilling. It was mainstream Hollywood fare, like we think of Johnny Depp and From Hell, but almost from the beginning of cinema, some of the first short movies and silent movies, which, the cinema was invented contemporaneous with Jack the Ripper, and it has fascinated Hollywood from the start, is all I wanted to say, and was seen as very much Lulu as a story about something very, very modern, that this was a symbol of the ills of modern society, promiscuity, the enemy of urban living, extreme urban poverty, lack of morality, God is dead, and everything is permitted, So it was seen as a symbol of its times even then. But definitely, if you love movies, check out the film, because it's really worth seeing. And
wasn't Jekyll and Hyde being performed at the time of the Ripper movies or Ripper murders?
Absolutely.
So I think it was in that zeitgeist too.
Yeah.
Even contemporary.
Penny Dreadful, which unfortunately I have not seen yet, but I am familiar with it.
I've just seen the pilot. I've not seen any of this.
It's worth checking out. It's like a compendium portmanteau show that just combines all these crazy... It's set in this period, which I love, and you've got Eva Green in it, who's bonkers.
It kind of reminds me a bit of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
And even a little bit of the Sherlock Holmes reboots that were starring Robert Downey Jr. A little bit. Well,
this isn't steampunky. It's actually it's completely ridiculous, but it's actually bizarrely well acted. It's like one of those things that if you do it completely deadpan and straight to camera with a complete earnestness of intention, you can almost make it fly. So if you're a sucker for Victoriana and Gothic and all this crazy stuff, then you must check it out.
Well, there's only 8 episodes in the first season, so it's very easy to sit and watch it all, I bet.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, okay, so let's talk about this other reference that was put in here. The Crimson Petal and the White, which is a novel. I don't know why does it connect to Jack the Ripper?
Michelle Faber, who is an amazing novelist, wrote a book called contemporary novelist, wrote a book called Crimson Petal and the White, which is set, again, exactly in this time period, and is about a prostitute who becomes the mistress of a successful industrialist. But it's not to do with Jack the Ripper directly, but it's very much of the milieu and everything crazy about Victorian London. So the obsession with sex, the puritanical religion, the hypocrisy of how the rich men treated the whores, the griminess of moving from the East End to the West End. It's all there in that novel, and if you love this period, you've got to read it. And it was also made into an absolutely amazing TV series, like one of the few truly successful adaptations, starring Romola Garai as the whore. And yeah, I would just say that there's a portrait of hysterical... Basically, the Crimson Petal and White, so the whore is Crimson Petal, the White is the wife of the industrialist, and she has never been taught the facts of life. And she thinks she's going mad when she has a child, when she has a period. She's abused by the doctor, and it just everything about that book tells you so much about what we were discussing in the last episode, Julia, about the position of women in this society, both rich and poor, and the kind of social environment in which the Ripper could happen. So, bit of a shout out to it.
Okay.
I will check that out.
Yeah, please do.
And then Evelyn Waugh.
Yeah, I only put that in there because, of course, there is the theory... Ooh, F.T. Wood, you can tell us. There is the theory that the last victim was a victim of the white slave trade and was taken to France, but escaped. Do you put any credence in that?
So Mary Kelly, or...
Yeah.
Well, I guess I don't know specifically the theory, I guess, but Mary Kelly's body was, unrecognizable, unfortunately. I mean, just horrible things done to her. So I guess I never even feel 100% safe knowing that was Mary Kelly's body. So I would think that a theory like that could make some sense.
Well, what is the theory? I'm not familiar
Oh
with
no, the
this.
theory is actually no. It's not that the body was switched out. The theory
Oh.
was that before she got to Whitechapel, that she had been a victim of the white slave trade. By which I mean that she had been lured by a rather charming man who said, "Would you like to come and work as a waitress in Paris, and we'll pay for your clothes and blah blah blah." And they ship you out in great style, and then when you get there, you realise you're being locked in a room and being made to be a whore, and that she got out. And it was a story she put about.
Yeah.
And it could or couldn't be true, but I just put it even more in the white slave trade, because if you read books like Decline and Fall, I mean, this is something that was, even later in the 1920s, was kind of mythologized, that pure young English girls were always at risk of being whisked off to sort of Brazil or sort of, and it's kind of the opposite, whereas today, London is rather sadly a centre for people being imported in the slave trade, the sexual slave trade.
Yeah.
But in that period, it was an export market, apparently. And Mary Kelly was apparently, or identified herself as one of the victims of this, whether or not correctly. So just
It's as likely as anything else. I mean, it does sound like the sort of thing that was going on at the time, and she's reported as being beautiful by the day's standards, and she had a very unsettled life, so it could have happened to her.
But
Yeah, her history is a little, as you said, that's the story she told, but we know that like Liz Stride and others told stories that just weren't true about how they got to be where they were and stuff. So,
well, if you end up as a hooker, I think that it's not surprising that you would try and justify or somehow make a story that enabled you to live with that. A great tragic story, a great tragic drama to somehow.
She was the most romanticized of the victims, I think, because
Yes,
of
for
her
sure.
age and stuff. So I'd be interested in into that as well.
With that, I think maybe it's time to wrap up.
I feel like that's a great place to end.
So I guess thanks to everyone for listening, and maybe we'll do more serial killer podcasts in the future. Yay!
This was a pleasure, so thank you very much for
Well, thank you guys.
for hosting.
Yeah,
Julia.
no problem. And I guess we'll talk more on other Be Okay podcasts, guys. Yeah.
See you later.
All right.
Bye.